You're probably watching this on a device that wouldn't even exist without the Industrial Revolution. It all started in Britain, right? Just a single spark on a small island. But that spark triggered a global chain reaction that completely reshaped societies and redrew the map of economic power forever. So let's dive into how this world-changing movement spread from its tiny home to, well, literally everywhere.
To really get a sense of the shockwave this caused, just listen to this. It's from 1795. John Eichen is basically saying that no amount of pure human effort, no matter how hard people worked, could have possibly kept up with demand without these new machines. This wasn't just about making things a little faster. For centuries, everything ran on muscle power, human and animal, and then suddenly, machines were in the driver's seat. There was just no turning back.
And that right there brings us to the core question of this whole explainer. What happened when this revolution left its home turf? How did other countries try to catch this lightning in a bottle? And what did it mean for the rest of the world? Okay, so before we take our trip around the globe, we have to understand the original recipe. What was Britain's secret sauce? What were the specific advantages that let them go first? So here it is, the key ingredients for Britain's industrial takeoff. They had tons of natural resources, like coal and iron just sitting there. They had easy transport thanks to all their waterways. They had a lot of cash, capital, ready for investment. They had a huge colonial empire for raw materials and, just as importantly, new markets. And critically, they had a government that was totally supportive of all this. Keep this checklist in mind because we're about to see how having, or not having, these things completely shape the destinies of other nations. All right, so Britain's blueprint is out in the open and the race is officially on. Let's see how this plan was copied, tweaked, and in some cases, even forced upon nations all around the world. First stop, the United States. After the absolute trauma of its civil war, the nation just threw all of its energy into industrializing at a truly breakneck pace. I mean, by 1900, America wasn't just competing with Britain. In a lot of areas, it was already leading the world. A massive part of America's success came down to one crucial resource, what we call human capital. The U.S. was flooded with a huge wave of immigrants from Europe and Asia. And these weren't just extra bodies. These were people with skills, with ambition, with new ideas. They were, quite literally, the human fuel for America's industrial fire. But if we head back across the Atlantic, the story looks really different. For Britain's closest neighbors, France and Germany, the road to industrialization was way slower and, frankly, full of roadblocks. So what was holding them back? Well, France was completely consumed by the French Revolution and then the Napoleonic Wars. Plus, its economy was all about handmade luxury goods, not mass-produced stuff. Germany, meanwhile, wasn't even a single country yet. It was just a patchwork of small, independent states. It wasn't until it finally unified in 1871 that it could really get its act together. So you can see, while Britain was busy building factories, its neighbors were busy building nations. And this slide is great because it shows two totally different paths to power. On one side, you've got the United States, where industrialization just bubbled up from the bottom. It was driven by entrepreneurs and all that human capital we just talked about. But then you look at Russia, and it's the complete opposite. It was a top-down, state-driven mission. The Tsar, terrified of Russia falling behind, pushed industrialization from the very highest levels of government. He sponsored these gigantic projects, like the Trans-Siberian Railroad, just to try and catch up. Meanwhile, way over on the other side of the world, Japan took a completely unique path. They looked around and saw Western powers carving up their neighbors, like China, and they basically said, nope, that is not going to be our fate. So they industrialized not just for profit, but for sheer survival. It's a strategy we call defensive modernization. And this quote right here, it says it all. After centuries of being totally isolated, a new government, the Meiji Restoration, took over in 1868 and made a radical choice. Their charter oath declared they would seek knowledge throughout the world to make Japan stronger. They actively sent people out to learn Western industrial techniques, not because they wanted to be Western, but so they could build up their own military and economic power to protect their independence. And now, we get to the twist in our story. The rise of all these new industrial powers had a powerful and often painful ripple effect. You see, for every new factory that opened its doors in Manchester or Pittsburgh, an old workshop often had to close its doors somewhere else. This new industrial order created some very clear winners, for sure. But that begs the question, right? Who were the losers? Who ended up paying the price for this massive global shift in how things were made?
This table tells a huge part of that story. The entire global economy was being rewired. Places from the Brazilian Amazon to West Africa were basically turned into giant farms and mines to supply raw materials, rubber, cotton, palm oil, to the factories in Europe and the US. They were providing all the essential ingredients but seeing none of the profits from the finished goods. They got stuck at the very bottom of the new economic ladder.
And the result of this new dynamic was a dramatic, seismic shift in power. When you look at the historical data, it's a stark reality. Regions in Asia and the Middle East that had been economic powerhouses for centuries saw their share of global manufacturing absolutely plummet.
Let's get specific, though. In India and Egypt, their world-famous textile industries were just crushed by a flood of cheaper, mass-produced British goods. In India, because it was under colonial rule, the decline was made even worse by specific policies. Their shipbuilding industry suffered, and local ironworks were crippled by British tariffs and even laws designed specifically to limit their production. So the really crucial point here is this wasn't just some natural economic shift. It was often intentional, creating dependencies that would last for generations.
So what does this all add up to? How did all these different paths, the fast adopters, the state-driven followers, and the ones who were deindustrialized, how did that all remake our world? Well, it created an entirely new global hierarchy.
At the end of the day, the spread of industrialization carved the world into two very distinct camps, a division that would define global politics for the next 100 years. You had the industrialized and the non-industrialized. Wealth and power became concentrated in the hands of the nations that controlled the factories.
So let's just quickly recap the big takeaways here. First, industrial production got super concentrated in just a handful of nations in Europe and North America. Second, this directly caused a massive decline for the once dominant manufacturing regions in Asia and the Middle East. And finally, as we saw, nations chased industrial power for very different reasons. Sometimes it was driven by free markets, sometimes commanded by the state, and sometimes it was a desperate act of self-defense.
Which brings us to our final thought. There's no doubt, industrialization created the modern world we live in, with all its incredible wealth and technology. But when you look at the deep inequalities it carved into the globe, inequalities that, let's be honest, still shape our lives today, you just have to ask, did it create a more equal one?